I spent a month picking the perfect dress for my sister's wedding, but it took only one sentence to rip me out of it. The doorman gave me a polite nod as I stepped through the towering glass doors of the Waldorf Astoria. I remember thinking the marble lobby felt colder than it should. The autumn air outside had been crisp, almost comforting, but in here, everything was hushed elegance and polished stone. I walked with purpose, heels clicking against the floor, gift bag swinging gently from my hand. The woman at the reception desk looked up, her smile just tight enough to seem forced. Platinum blonde hair pulled back into a sleek ponytail, not a strand out of place. I gave her my name, voice steady. She hesitated. That was the first crack. She began flipping through her guest list, manicured nails clicking against the paper. I stood quietly, smoothing down my dress, ignoring the stir of nerves in my stomach. I had RSVP'd. I had mailed the gift. I had written the card. Everything was in place, except me. The receptionist's lips parted slightly. "I'm sorry," she said with the kind of tone reserved for customer complaints and missed spa appointments. "But your name isn't on the list." I blinked. "That must be a mistake," I said, careful to keep my voice calm. "The bride is my sister." She nodded, looking momentarily flustered. "Of course. Let me double-check." If you've ever felt like the outsider in your own family story, drop a comment, tap like, and follow for more quiet reckonings like this one. Your support keeps these stories alive. Pages turned, eyes scanned, her brows furrowed, then smoothed with resignation. I don't see it here." A prickle crawled up the back of my neck. "Could you check again?" She obliged, going back through the stack as if that would magically produce my name. Behind her, the grand ballroom doors opened briefly. A swell of classical music drifted out, soft strings, laughter, clinking glass. My stomach twisted. "I'm really sorry, Miss Hayes," she said at last, voice dropping lower. "But your name isn't here. Dad used to say weddings were about family. I guess he never imagined mine would erase me from it." I inhaled through my nose, sharp and slow. "That doesn't make sense," I said. "Isabel is my sister. I should be on that list." She leaned forward slightly, dropping her voice to almost a whisper. "It wasn't a mistake." I stared at her. "Excuse me?" Ever been blindsided by the people who were supposed to protect you? Comment below if you've felt it too. Like and follow if you believe stories like this deserve to be told and remembered. Your mother personally requested your name be removed. I was told, under no circumstances. My ears began to ring. I barely heard the rest. Something about how she was sorry. How she understood this was awkward. Awkward. That was the word she chose? My fingers tightened around the ribboned handles of the gift bag. It felt too light all of a sudden. I hadn't expected a warm welcome. Not with how things had been between Grace and me since Dad died. But this? This was something else. This wasn't tension. This was exile. A slow numbness crept up my spine. I stood perfectly still, watching the receptionist fidget. I could barge in, demand answers, march into that ballroom and make a scene right in front of Isabel's new in-laws. But what would that do? Grace would play innocent, her specialty. Isabel would look blindsided or worse, indifferent. The room would turn to stare. I'd become a story. A whisper passed over champagne glasses. Number, if they didn't want me here, I wouldn't stay. I looked down at the gift I had carried. A white shawl, hand-embroidered with soft blue flowers. Delicate and slow work that took me weeks. I'd chosen the colors carefully. The same ones from the shawl Dad had gifted Mom on their wedding day. That one used to sit in the cedar chest at the foot of our old bed, where Isabel and I would sneak it out to play dress-up. That memory felt like it belonged to someone else now. I stepped forward and placed the gift on the counter with slow precision. "Please make sure this gets to the bride," I said. The receptionist nodded, visibly relieved. "Of course." The card was simple, just a cream envelope tucked beneath the ribbon. For Isabel, wishing you happiness. No more. No less. I adjusted the strap of my purse and turned on my heel. Every step toward the door felt like it echoed. Maybe it was my imagination. Or maybe it was the weight of all those invisible eyes watching, wondering who I was and why I was leaving before the ceremony even started. I didn't look back. Outside, the September air hit my skin like glass. Sharp, clean, too honest. Cars zipped past on Lake Road, their lights flickering against the sidewalk. Somewhere down the block, a rooftop bar erupted in laughter. A world still spinning. Even though mine had shifted in the space of a sentence, I kept walking until I reached the edge of the curb. Then I stopped. I reached into my purse, fingers brushing against my phone, smooth and cold. I pulled it out and stared at the screen, thumb hovering. Isabel's name was still at the top of my favorites. I hadn't moved it, not even after months of her silence. I tapped. 1 ring, 2, 3. Then, voicemail. Outside in the street, Amelia scrolls to Isabel's number. She calls. It rings. Then, voicemail. They erased me from the guest list, but they forgot. I keep every receipt. The moment I stepped back into my apartment, I shut the door gently behind me and stood still. Not because I was tired. I wasn't. If anything, something inside me had clicked into place. A kind of sharp, icy clarity that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with instinct. I was trained for this. I was a nurse. I charted. I tracked. I remembered. The place was quiet except for the steady hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock above the stove. I dropped my keys in the ceramic dish near the entry, slid off my shoes, and padded toward the living room. The light was fading through the windows, casting long slants of gold across the floor. I didn't turn on the lamp. Instead, I went straight to the bookshelf, bottom row, behind the textbooks. I pulled out a small, worn wooden box. One of those things you keep telling yourself you'll go through. Someday. I had taken it after Dad died, not knowing why, only that it felt wrong to leave it behind in that house with her. I carried it to the table, sat down, and opened the lid. Folders, receipts, bank statements, a flash drive I hadn't seen in years, and tucked along the side, a soft leather notepad with Dad's looping handwriting across the cover. Truth leaves a paper trail. Keep it safe. I swallowed hard. Then I started reading. The first few folders were familiar. College paperwork, FAFSA forms I had helped Isabel submit. I had forgotten how many nights I stayed up editing her essays while she cried over law school applications. And there, tucked between a manila envelope of textbook invoices, was a copy of a cashier's check. My name on the from line, her rent, again, and again, and again. I leaned back slightly, counted. 7 rent payments, 2 deposits for tuition, 1 for bar prep, all signed by me. All from a period when I was working double shifts at the hospital, scraping together what little I had because Isabel just needed a little help. I kept going. Toward the bottom of the stack was a file labeled Estate J.H. I opened it carefully. The first few pages were what I expected. Funeral arrangements, a few condolences typed on company letterhead. But then, a life insurance form. $250,000. Payable to Amelia Hayes. Except the routing showed something else entirely. The payout had been redirected, reassigned to G. Hayes 1 month after Dad passed. My fingers went cold. I blinked, stared, looked again. Same numbers, same form, same rerouted funds. There, attached to the back, was a digital printout of a signature page. My name. My supposed authorization. Only I never signed it. I felt the breath catch at the back of my throat. My penmanship had always been clean, looped from left to right with a nurse's steadiness. This one was jagged, oddly spaced. It was an imitation. Not perfect, but just close enough for someone not looking too hard. Grace had forged my signature. I sat very still for a moment, listening to the silence of the apartment press in around me. This wasn't favoritism. This wasn't about Isabel getting more hugs, more praise, more invitations. This was theft, deliberate, documented, and silent, just like the way she had erased me from the wedding. I pushed the chair back, stood and walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, drank it too fast, then poured another. My hands weren't shaking. Not yet. That was the surprising part. I didn't feel broken. I felt something else, like a dam cracking, not shattering, just splitting slow and clean down the middle. She had taken the last thing Dad left me. She had done it quietly, and worse, confidently, knowing I would never ask, never dig, because I trusted her. Not anymore. I returned to the table, laid the forged document beside the rest, and opened my laptop. My fingers hovered over the keys, but I didn't hesitate. I typed, Jonathan Hayes, estate lawyer, Lake Forest. A list of names appeared. I scrolled, scanning. Bradley and Associates. I recognized the name immediately. Dad had spoken of them once. Small firm, discreet, loyal to him more than the money. I clicked the website. There was a photo. A man in his 50s. Kind eyes. Clean gray suit. William Bradley. Partner. I copied the number. Saved it. I didn't know exactly what I was going to say when I called, but I knew why I was calling. She had stolen from me. She had rewritten the narrative, made me the problem, the absent daughter, the ungrateful sister. But she had forgotten the one thing Dad always told me. Truth leaves a paper trail, and I had just found it. She opens her laptop, types, Jonathan Hayes, estate lawyer, Lake Forest. A result pops up. Bradley and Associates. I buried my father 5 years ago, but today, he spoke to me. The Hayes house hadn't changed. That was the strangest part. The shutters still creaked in the wind. The porch light flickered when I twisted the key in the lock. Even the air smelled the same. A mix of cedar polish and old books. Like time had been paused just long enough for dust to settle in the corners. I let myself in through the side door, the one that opened into the kitchen. No one used it but him. Grace had always insisted on the front door, the image, the greeting, but Dad preferred quiet entries. No spectacle, no footsteps echoing through the foyer. I stood for a moment, letting the silence press against me. The house felt hollow, the walls thinner somehow. Or maybe it was just that I was older now. I knew what had happened here, what had been stolen in whispers and forged signatures. Dad never let me into his locked drawer. After he died, Grace told me to forget it. He left nothing for you anyway. But he had, and I was about to prove it. I moved through the hall, past the grandfather clock that hadn't worked since his funeral, and into the study. The curtains were half drawn, letting in long slices of autumn light. Dust floated in the air, visible, unmoving. His desk was still where it had always been, solid, mahogany, and locked. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the small brass key I'd found inside the wooden box last week. I hadn't known what had opened at first, but now, I was sure. The lock clicked open. I pulled out the top drawer, slow and steady. Inside, pens, an old checkbook, a photo of me and Isabel as kids, both in Halloween costumes. I was a ghost, she a princess. The next drawer held files, organized, labeled with Dad's careful hand. Nothing unusual. It was the bottom drawer that mattered. I slid it open and froze. There, lying flat and pristine beneath a thin layer of parchment, was a sealed envelope, cream-colored, heavy, and across the front, written in Dad's handwriting, "For Amelia, if Grace fails her promise." I stared at it. The words didn't blur or shift. They were certain, meant for me. Guarded all these years behind a lock Grace had never had the patience or decency to respect. With careful fingers, I broke the seal. The letter inside was short. 3 pages. Written in Dad's slanted script. "Amelia, if you're reading this, then Grace made a choice I prayed she wouldn't. I asked her to protect you, not to punish you for choosing a life different from what she imagined. You gave up so much to care for me, more than you ever should have had to. I saw it. I remembered it. And I made sure that you would be taken care of after I was gone. Enclosed is the original will, notarized, signed, and witnessed, which awards you 70% of my estate. Isabel has her education and her name. You deserve your peace. If Grace cut you out, it means she's afraid. That means you win, but not with vengeance. You win by remembering who you are. There's a man you can trust. William Bradley, my estate lawyer. His number is at the bottom. If you're ready, call him. Love always, Dad." I didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, I opened the second document, a neatly folded legal form with bold stamps in the corner. Notarized. Jonathan Hayes. Amelia Hayes. Percentage listed, 70%. Isabel, 30%. Grace. Nothing. Dad had been deliberate, meticulous. He knew what Grace might do, and he had prepared for it. My hands trembled slightly as I placed the documents back in the envelope and slid it into my coat. The warmth of it, the weight, felt like armor. I stepped out of the study, closing the drawer gently behind me. The house felt different now, still quiet, but no longer hollow, like Dad had just leaned in and whispered something to me before fading back into the walls. I walked outside, locking the door behind me. In the car, I sat for a long moment, staring at the number written in the bottom corner of the letter, Bradley and Associates. I tapped the digits into my phone. The line rang once. Then, "Bradley speaking. I was wondering when you'd call. My mother once told me, power isn't about being loved. It's about being too valuable to lose." So today I showed her just how replaceable she is. The Cavendish Club stood like a shrine to curated perfection. White pillars, gold-trimmed doors, a valet who never made eye contact unless your last name was etched on a plaque somewhere inside. I stepped out of the car, heels silent on the slate steps, carrying only a flat leather folder and the kind of calm that terrified people like Grace. Inside, the club hummed softly, crystal catching light, silverware clinking, the rustle of silk blouses brushing against high-backed chairs.
Brunch was in full swing. Women with lives so tightly wound you could pluck a harpstring from their spines. And at the center table, as always, was my mother, Grace Hayes. She looked flawless, of course, cream cashmere set, pearl earrings, that careful posture that said, "I belong here, you don't." She was mid-sip when she saw me, a flicker of recognition in her eyes, then something sharper. A pause, but not a falter. She recovered fast. "Amelia?" she said, dabbing her lips with a cloth napkin as I approached. "How unexpected." Her friends turned to stare, not overtly, not rudely, just enough for their interest to register without betraying etiquette. I offered her a small smile. "Isn't it?" She gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Sit, if you must." I didn't sit. I placed the folder on the table between us. Grace arched a brow. Are we trading documents now? No, I said softly. I'm returning something that was always mine. She didn't touch it. I opened the folder myself, slid out the notarized will, the forged insurance form, and a copy of Dad's letter, typed transcript, his signature intact, even the ink from his fountain pen visible in the scan. Her expression didn't change, but her fingers curled just slightly around the stem of her glass. This, I said, is the original will. The one that left 70% of Dad's estate to me. I tapped the insurance form. And this is the forged authorization you submitted to reroute his life insurance. Money meant for me. Her smile didn't waver. That's quite an accusation. No, I replied. It's a documented crime. One of the women at the table, a younger one with ash blonde hair and curious eyes, shifted in her seat. Grace didn't look at her. She didn't look at anyone, only me. I did what I had to for this family, she said at last, her voice like chilled porcelain. I leaned in, not breaking eye contact. Number you did what served you. The rest of us were props in the Grace Hayes production. Her lips twitched, just barely. You always did have a flair for dramatics. I nodded. So did you. Only difference is, I kept the receipts. Her mask was cracking, not crumbling. Just hairline fractures. A twitch in the jaw. A pause between breaths. The kind of tremor no one else would notice, unless they'd been watching her their whole life. She reached for her teacup. Her hand shook, just slightly. Enough that a drop spilled onto the saucer. Her fingers stiffened. She set the cup down quickly, as if it had burned her. I stood. You don't need to say anything, I told her. You already lost the only thing you cared about. Control. And then I walked away. The silence behind me was louder than any confrontation. No raised voices, no slammed fists, just murmurs. As I passed the table by the window, I heard one of the older women whisper, not unkindly, "That poor girl. We always wondered why she never came around." The message came late. "Can we talk?" 3 words, and I knew the dam had cracked. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Her name glowed at the top. Isabel Hayes, still saved with a heart emoji I'd forgotten to delete. It didn't feel ironic. It felt old, worn out from meaning. I waited 20 minutes before I replied. Tomorrow, 11 a.m., Dad's Cafe. The next morning, the Riverside Cafe looked just like it had when we were kids, slightly too dim inside, always smelling of roasted hazelnut and cinnamon. Our father used to say it was the only place that felt honest in this town. No Polish, no pretense, just chipped mugs and tables that wobbled. I picked the booth by the window, the one closest to the river bend. Outside, the trees had begun their final blaze of color, burnt orange, amber gold, a few stubborn greens clinging to the last warmth of fall. She arrived right on time, not a minute early, not a second late. Isabel slid into the booth across from me, her coat still buttoned. She looked smaller, like someone who had finally started questioning the shape of their reflection. "I almost didn't come," she said. "I figured." She exhaled slowly. "Why now?" I reached into my bag and pulled out the same leather folder I'd shown Grace. I didn't push it across the table. I simply laid it there, between us, like a line I was daring her to cross. "What is it?" she asked. "Proof." She didn't move. I opened the folder for her. First the will, then the forged insurance form, then the transcript of Dad's letter. Her eyes scanned quickly at first, a lawyer's habit, then slower. Her shoulders stiffened, her lips parted, but no sound came out. When she reached the final page, she froze. "She told me you stopped caring," Isabel whispered. "That you cut us off. That you didn't even call after Dad died because you were ashamed of what you'd done." My throat went tight. "I never left," I said. "I was pushed out." She blinked, once, twice, then looked up at me. "She said you didn't even try." I texted. I sent gifts, letters. She intercepted them. Isabel shook her head like she was trying to dislodge something. I thought I was her favorite. I didn't answer. Tears welled in her eyes. She clutched the documents like they might dissolve if she let go. But I was just her project, wasn't I? The words cracked her open. Her voice, her composure, the illusion that she had been anything more than a piece in Grace's carefully built narrative. It all shattered in that one sentence. She told me you were the one who couldn't be trusted, that Dad didn't think you deserved anything. I slid the original letter forward, the one with Dad's signature, still faintly smudged in the corner. Read it again. She did. Silence wrapped around us like a second atmosphere, dense, heavy, unforgiving. I didn't try to comfort her, not yet. This wasn't a wound I could bandage. She had to bleed first. Isabel wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. She lied to me, my whole life. She lied to both of us. She looked at me then, really looked. Her face was blotchy, red around the eyes, and yet something in it had settled. Less panic, more clarity. I don't know what to do, she said. You don't have to do anything right now. She nodded slowly, folded the papers, tucked them carefully back into the folder. Then she stood. I'll call you later. That night, just past midnight, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. Isabel, give me time. I'm not ready to choose. But I believe you now. I waited years for an apology. But in the end, the silence was louder, and somehow more honest. The pen felt surprisingly light in my hand as I signed the last document. My name, again and again, looping steadily in black ink at the bottom of each page. Across the table, Mr. Bradley nodded with quiet finality and slid the papers into a manila envelope. It's done, he said. The inheritance was restored. My father's will, the real one, had been honored at last. Grace didn't contest it. She didn't call, didn't try to bargain. She had settled quietly, like someone trying to avoid triggering an avalanche they could no longer control. I asked Mr. Bradley once if he thought she regretted it. He paused, folded his hands on the desk, and said, "Regret requires self-awareness. What she has is fear. It didn't satisfy me, but it didn't need to." I thanked him and stepped out into the cold November air. The leaves had nearly finished falling, leaving behind skeletal branches etched against a gray sky. The wind had teeth now, but I liked it. It woke you up. Reminded you that some endings didn't burn. They simply faded. Back at home, I had a message waiting. Isabel. I've moved out. She doesn't own my story anymore. No ceremony, no explanation, just a declaration, simple and whole. I stared at the words for a long time before replying, "Good. Neither do you." That afternoon, I stopped by a cafe near the lake. Not Dad's old place. This one was tucked between a florist and a tailor shop, with mismatched chairs and chalkboard menus. I ordered a chamomile tea and sat by the window, just breathing. No laptop, no folder, just stillness. And that was when I saw her. Across the street, sitting alone outside a boutique cafe, was Grace. She wore a dark gray coat, no pearls, no makeup, no posture. Her shoulders hunched slightly and her hands curled around a cup of coffee she didn't seem to be drinking. There was no one beside her, no phone in hand, just a woman in a world that no longer bent to her name. She looked up. Our eyes met. She didn't flinch, didn't gesture, just lifted her cup and offered a thin, hollow smile. I nodded once. No malice, no satisfaction, just a quiet acknowledgement of something long finished. Then I stood, turned, and walked away. No one followed, no one watched. The city kept moving, horns in the distance, leaves scraping against pavement. The kind of ordinary that once felt unreachable, back when I was still trying to be part of a family that never saw me. Back at my apartment, I kicked off my shoes, opened the window slightly, and let the cool air roll in. An hour later, a notification blinked on my screen. Subject, Northlake Medical Fellowship nomination. Message, Dear Ms. Hayes, we're pleased to inform you that you've been nominated for the Northlake Medical Fellowship. We believe in your work and your voice. I stared at it for a moment, then smiled. Victory isn't loud. It's living a life untouched by those who tried to erase you. In the end, it wasn't a courtroom or a headline that brought justice, just a quiet signature and a woman who finally chose herself. Grace lost her power not in a dramatic collapse, but in the slow erosion of silence and consequence. The truth, buried beneath years of control, surfaced because someone dared to keep the receipts and believe they mattered. Like the final chord of a long-forgotten melody, justice may arrive late, but it resonates powerfully once it's heard.
Because no matter how well crafted the illusion, the truth always remembers its way home. If Amelia's journey resonated with you, leave a comment, tap like, and follow for more stories about quiet strength, overdue justice, and voices that refuse to be erased. Your support helps bring the next one to life.